We're steadying out. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the CFCI lunchtime seminar. I am absolutely delighted today to introduce two fantastic women who have got a broad range of experience in the ESG space. They're absolutely fantastic. We've got Sophie Taysom, who is the founder and director of Keyah Consulting. She has a huge amount of experience, many years working both in the UK and internationally, as well as in all sorts of different media outlets. And Hannah Durden, who 2 years ago set up her own company dealing with sustainable development consultancy, CNZW. She's a fellow land economist like me. She was in the college next door to me, now Murray Edwards, formerly Newhall. And we're delighted they're going to present for us for about 35 minutes. Please can you post your questions into the Q&A at the bottom, and Simon, one of our other trustees, will pick up to deal with those and moderate after the ladies are finished. So thank you, ladies, and welcome to the CFCI.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us, and thanks so much for that introduction, Emma. So today, Hannah and I are going to be running through quite a lot in the context of considering ESG in construction. So the slides are quite detailed. Feel free, obviously, to take notes and what have you. The slides will be circulated after this, so don't feel like if you miss something, it's an issue. So first up, a little more about us. I'm Dr. Sophie Taysom, director and founder of Keyah Consulting. Keyah is a girl's name meaning in good health. I also established on LinkedIn the ESG in real estate group, which is slowly creeping up to about 2,500 people. So feel free to come and join that if you're not already a member. I'm on the healthcare panel with the Institution of Engineering and Technology, which is a professional membership body for engineers and technologists, of which I'm neither. I'm also a trustee with Groundwork with London, which focuses on people, place and planet, and they do a whole variety of programs right across London, and a non-exec director with TrustTech, who focus on supporting companies to develop a strategic approach to prop tech. Hannah, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Emma and Sophie, for the brief intros. My name's Hannah Durden, as Emma touched on, fellow land economist, although it seems like a long time ago now. My background is I'm a chartered surveyor. I trained in the city, working on both the client and the advisory side. I then worked for a small southeast developer, building offices, retrofitting offices, and also taking advantage of the PDR regulations that came in, so converting office buildings to residential. And I did that for about 8 or 9 years. And I think out of frustration with perhaps the developers' commerciality, I've subsequently segued into the sustainability space. I set up CNZW, that stands for Carbon Neutral Zero Waste Developments, supposedly doing what it says on the tin, but I set it up really to focus on developments and sustainable development strategy on developments and bigger master plans. That's actually segued into quite a lot of business consultancy, working on ESG strategies. And that's how Sophie and I have met, is working on business strategies. Sophie has a bit more of a focus on the S and health and wellbeing side of things, whereas I'm coming at it from a slightly more practical development view on the E side, and we collaborate in the middle on the G side of things too. Anyway, back to you, Sophie.
Fantastic. Thanks, Hannah. So today we're going to be covering, and this is obviously an absolute whistle-stop tour, I'll be discussing what ESG is and why it matters. Hannah will then be talking a bit more in more detail around the ESG, specifically in construction and the built environment. And then we'll be doing a bit of a double act in terms of what now and how to get started. So first up, what is ESG and why does it matter? So ESG fundamentally, well, it stands for environmental, social and governance considerations. It's really about risk management. So it's business risk management from a whole range of considerations. So with environment, social and governance, it's kind of like 3 buckets. They're slightly leaky. So there's no point getting caught up on things like, well, human rights, well, that's a social issue, that's also a governance issue, these sorts of things. So in the bucket that is the environment, we have issues like the transition and climate change, biodiversity, energy efficiency, water material wastage. In the social bucket, and I like to think of this in terms of how a company operates, so all those sort of internal sets of issues, as well as then that sort of external, particularly that social value piece. So in terms of thinking about those internal considerations, it's things like staff health and well-being, human rights, employee development and retention, health and safety, which is obviously a huge issue in the construction industry, and also diversity and inclusion. In terms of that social value piece, that can be a whole range of things. So that could be anything from engaging with supply chains at the local level, engaging with and trying to develop, say, the workforce of the future, diversity and inclusion in terms of managing community and those wider stakeholder relationships. And under governance, we have really important considerations like ownership and control, financial management, and really around sort of risk management. There's also that other element of that management of ESG issues. So who's responsible, for instance, at board or senior exec level for ESG commitments? Why now? Okay, so the last few years, just one or two things have been going on. In terms of the seismic shift and the really big market reorientation and regulatory reorientation to ESG, we've obviously had significant climate events. Obviously, the built environment in particular is at high risk. That photo from the top left-hand corner is probably, so that house is probably about 5 minutes walk away from where I grew up in Brisbane. So beginning of last year, they had huge floods in Australia. What we're seeing now is those 1 in 50, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 year events pretty much happening every 6 months. The bottom half of Australia is currently freezing. So snow, so unseasonably cold, like just bizarrely cold for this time of year. And, you know, we also know that Spain and a lot of Asia are undergoing massive heat waves at the moment. So obviously extreme weather events. We've also had the Black Lives Matter movement, which has had a really big impact, the cost of living crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, both in the context of the energy crisis, but also in terms of a much bigger focus on things like supply chains and how we engage with supply chains. COVID-19, what COVID-19 really brought to the fore, health inequalities, social inequalities, economic inequalities. So increasingly this sort of idea about what more can business do? So a lot going on. And there are a number of key drivers. So for clients I've worked with, it can be a mix of these. It tends to be more than just, I'm just looking for money or I need to retain staff. So it can be anything from growing lender and investor interest, liquidity and value, mitigation, and I think this is a really, really important one, of current and future risks. So these are risks to assets, portfolios, but also to the business as a whole. There's a big set of issues around attracting and retaining staff. Current and emerging regulatory requirements, which are changing every 5 minutes. So I've certainly seen a number of experts who work specifically just on regs, who even they're sort of sitting there with a wet towel over their head, horrified at just how quickly, well, not horrified, but sort of having a real challenge with trying to keep up with all of this. And very much about improved visibility and credibility at the business level. Increasingly, people are expecting to see these things. And I quite like this quote from Mark Carney. So in the future, climate and the ESG considerations will likely be at the heart of mainstream investing. Investors will tailor their investments and fulfill their fiduciary duties through better quality and more widely available data on sustainability and performance, and more informed judgments on strategic resilience. That point, particularly around better quality and more widely available data, is a really, really useful one to note and absolutely critical. And we're also seeing a big shift in the investment landscape. So obviously over the last year or so, the overall kind of global investment trends, there have been sort of various things going on, obviously. What we saw last year, though, even though there was sort of massive outflows of investments from pretty much all funds, those funds considered like dark green funds, so more sustainable funds, were better at holding up than non-green funds. And we're also seeing still sort of year-on-year growth in this area. And it's worth just touching on what's happening at the corporate level. So in terms of the regulatory context, there's a huge amount happening both in the UK as well as the EU. And I'll go on to say why the EU is really significant here. So in the UK, there are big plans for better enhancing ESG disclosures. It does remain a hodgepodge. So we've got, for instance, last year's introduction of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, basically means that sort of 1,300 of the largest UK registered companies and financial institutions need to report against that. The UK is in the process of developing its own sustainability disclosure regulations. There is also a set of regulations which will come further down the line from something called the ISSB, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board. They haven't yet published the detail of what that will be. There's also, as many of you will be aware, a gamut of reporting requirements. So anything from modern day slavery to gender equity and pay. It's also really important in the context of the UK to consider how it aligns with EU legislation. So this could be the Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulations or the EU taxonomy. I do particularly want to flag the Corporate Sustainability Disclosure Regulations, which will have a significant impact on a number of companies either operating in the EU or EU companies with operations in the UK that will need to report into this. So that piece of legislation, so that got passed by the European Parliament in January of this year, and then the EU countries have 18 months to translate it into their own sort of legal frameworks. Where that will have an impact also will be in terms of supply chains. So if you're part of a supply chain, it's worth keeping abreast of these things. And there are multiple reporting frameworks. So there's no one internationally agreed reporting framework in the context of the ESG. What these are designed to do are essentially track performance, set and measure ESG, various sort of data points. So it could be around social value, could be around global greenhouse gas emissions, and also really communicate ESG credentials. Certainly in the context of working with my clients to develop frameworks, my personal favorites are actually the Global Reporting Initiative. So essentially the top 200 or so global companies tend to report using the Global Reporting Initiative. I'm also a really big fan of GRESB. So GRESB is an ESG benchmark for real assets. And where that comes in to be really, really helpful is there are specific kind of data points and metrics for construction and for assets and portfolios. So it's really helpful from that point of view. Now I'm going to pass over to Hannah to talk more about ESG specifically in the context of construction. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sophie. I think we're going to kick straight off with a very quick a short film, or not film, a short clip from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. The EMF are a really great resource, and they're doing lots in the built environment in terms of how we need to change the economic makeup and the way that we do business in order to think back to those great days at primary school, junior school, when you were learning about the water cycle, and think how we might apply that in particular to how we build buildings, demount buildings, and then perhaps reuse some bits of those buildings. So let's have a quick watch of this.
We live in a world with finite materials.
We are throwing an awful lot of electronics, plastic, food, carpets, clothing away. It's a waste of precious materials.
If we could build an economy that would use things rather than use them up, we could build a future that really could work in the long term.
You design the product in a way that
Can be taken apart. Once the consumer has finished using them,
you remanufacture it and give it out again. You can reduce your production costs hugely if applied correctly.
Instead of garments ending up in landfill,
companies can repurpose it, reuse it, making profit out of their waste.
We take some resources from nature and bring it back in the form of nutrients.
It's very much a natural cycle.
We use 70% less water than conventional agricultural methods.
Our packaging is not a waste, it's something that you can consume and eat.
We redesign everyday products to make them fully recyclable.
We farm as close to nature as is possible.
the H&M Group has set ambitious targets to use 100% sustainably sourced materials.
There is a lot of conversation about not buying clothes, but different models where you can rent clothing.
We developed fully modular headphones that we offer on a subscription basis.
The circular economy itself is inevitable in my view.
It's not one fix, it's about the entire system being redesigned.
This is, to me, the only way to fight climate change, to fight pollution, to fight waste.
This is a business model that stacks up.
Global companies cannot survive in the future without transitioning towards a circular economy. That is a really exciting future.
Thank you. Can we jump onto the next slide now, Sophie? Thanks. So you've probably been or seen this stat added for NITEM over the last couple of years, but the fact is that the buildings and construction globally contribute just under 40% of the CO2 emissions that we see globally. It means that we really need to start thinking about how we employ those circular policies, in particular as the grid decarbonises, to how we are building buildings and certainly designing them as well. Going back a bit to the regulatory context to sort of set the scene, one thing that always delights me is that actually the Climate Change Act has been around for a while, going back to 2008. And Theresa May's parting gift when she left government was the Target Amendment Order in 2019, setting the UK on a course to become the first economy to commit to net zero emissions by 2050. I'm actually, with my clients, working really hard on focusing on 2030. I think 2050 is too far off, and I think the stuff that we do this decade will be absolutely critical to hitting that target at a later date. So anybody that you're working with who's bringing in mañana, it doesn't wash with me anymore. I think we really need to be looking at stuff now. Buildings that we're designing and building now will still be standing in 10, 15 years. And we really need to see this 50% drop in emissions now, between now and 2030, to try and avoid some of these quite extreme climate events that we are undoubtedly going to see. The Environment Bill 2020 is the most recent bit of legislation that we've seen, now ratified, and probably there's some of the key elements that you'll see to this are coming in from November this year around biodiversity net gain, and that's probably the biggest growth area that I've seen amongst clients asking for advice, asking where to get that advice. You're seeing the likes of GPE, British Land have all now got these biodiversity strategies in place and looking to really improve the green space they're providing, both within buildings and also in terms of wider public space, which, as Sophie said, flits nicely between the two buckets because it both helps with well-being and also the actual environment on site. The Department for Business, Economy and Industrial Strategy, this consultation has really flown on from the minimum energy efficiency standards, or MEES, which lots of you will be dealing with at the moment if you haven't been for the last few years. They're now looking beyond the EPCs. I think we all know that EPCs are a really blunt tool, but they're doing the job, and they're starting to really focus companies on how they design and operate buildings. They're now looking at energy efficient reports, and Lord Deben had written to the devolved parliaments earlier this year to say we need to move EPCs on. They also did consult in March last year on a neighbours star rating, going back to Australia where Sophie started earlier in this presentation. Neighbours is a rating that they have, or a certification that they came up with in Australia over 20 years ago, looking at the operational efficiency of buildings. And again, going back to British Land, who are probably setting the benchmark, they are purely focused on neighbours' performance now, and looking to get those operational emissions down to zero. And alongside that, we'll see this increased focus on embodied carbon and whole life carbon analysis, which many of you will be looking into or getting involved increasingly with. Building regs, I think we will all have been affected by the improvements that we saw to building regs in June of last year. The main ones being to Part L, conservation of fuel and power, changing those carbon factors. So we had clients in a big rush when I was consulting with Hollis, big rush to make sure the EPCs were done under the old regs, because there's been this sort of 30-35% improvement in emissions, trying to really push those standards forwards. The future home standard, we're all sort of waiting with bated breath. That seems to be getting closer to this sort of passive house standard, using some of the LETI targets. There was a lot of discussion around that from CFCI at Future Build a couple of months ago, and hopefully we'll see this Conservative government finally do something that's really pushing the boundaries. It saddens me that we had the Code for Sustainable Homes, and that we were targeting building 100% net zero homes by 2016, back in the sort of early to mid noughties when I was writing my dissertation and looking at sustainable development and definitions of that. So I really hope that the Future Home Standard will start to push that on. And there's the likes of Barratt Developments who are doing some really good collaborative work with University of Safford up in Manchester, for example, where they effectively have a heat chamber, and they are using that to I think they're on to version 2 now of their net zero home, and now looking at how to get the costs down of building these buildings that are performing, thermally much better insulated than we've been delivering previously. We're seeing a phasing out of refrigerants and cooling, coolants for air conditioning, and really moving to this heat exchange system, doing a lot with clients in terms of retrofitting air source heat pumps. PV is a big area there as well. And then, MEES I've touched on already, when we're looking at these EPCs and trying to really bring the standard of building up so that we are able to deal with the only legislation that we have got, from what I've seen, looking at MEES standards and making sure that by the end of this decade, so stuff that we're designing now is working at an EPC B or better. Next slide, please, Sophie. A little bit of a smorgasbord of images here. When I was writing my dissertation back at Cambridge, I went to a sustainable development conference, and one of the discussions at one of the talks said, what is the definition of sustainable development? And an architect got up and he said, look, the Georgian terrace or Victorian terrace is my definition of sustainable development. And I've always sort of harped back to that. They were well built 150 years ago. They still stand today. They've retained their value. They've allowed flexibility. Everybody does their side return extensions. They've gone from open plan back to broken plan post-COVID, and those buildings still stand today. I really love the BedZ scheme in Hackbridge that was built in the late 90s, and it still stands as a beacon example of what net zero homes should look like. We've got the heat pumps, we've got some rooftop agriculture in there, and going really back to natural materials, starting to think about carbon sequestration, and both using natural materials and perhaps some newer materials like biochar that are sequestering more carbon than they produce when they're being made. Next slide, please, Sophie. And then just drilling down a little bit more to ESG and construction and some of the focus areas. I think a lot of you will be dealing with EPDs on site, and some of these building certifications like Neighbours, but I think BREEAM is probably the leading one there. I've actually been involved recently with a DREAM assessment, which is the MOD version of BREEAM. So I'm delighted to see that even the MOD are starting to think about this. Going back to all those circular pieces, how can you save as much water, capture as much water, think about sustainable drainage and the water that is going back into our drainage systems and where that may end up, also what's going into it in the first place. I think pollution is a big piece for me in terms of what those buildings are producing beyond greenhouse gases. I've been trying to really encourage some of my clients to have circularity centres rather than waste centres or bin stores, trying to make those areas much cleaner and nicer to be in so that people aren't just chucking stuff into bins without thinking about it. Modular buildings are going to become much, much bigger. And again, the likes of Barratt and other contractors looking at those to bring programs down, again, improve your profitability, but also look at accuracy on site, reducing waste on site. And then I think probably one of the most important pieces to this, which we'll come back to time and time again, is the tech and data piece. So how much data are we collecting from the buildings? How much information have we got on what the building is made of? And how we'll then use that in the future to demount buildings and then rebuild them should we get to that point. The social piece, I think, is really important, certainly for the construction industry. The construction industry has at least one suicide a day, and I know that rate has gone up over the last 2 years. I do some work with my father's construction company over in sort of Bedfordshire, Buckinghamshire, and looking at the actual physical well-being of the people working on site and how we can support them and improve their productivity. There's been a lot of discussion about moving to a 4-day week and how much that would help them in terms of the longevity of their ability to work and their mental and physical health. Health and safety, I think, is something that is part of all the jobs that we do. And I really hope that the sustainability piece will become like health and safety over the next 10, 20 years. Supply chain, looking at modern slavery, I think sometimes it's quite easy for people to think it doesn't apply to us. But I've had experience recently with contractors using Ukrainian labour, and a lot of the permits and what have you not being correctly in place. It's happening right on our doorstep, and the construction industry in particular in the UK has a lot of work to do in that area. Ask the question is what I say to all my clients. Just ask the question of the people that are supplying materials and labour to you, because it forces people to think about it, even if at this stage you're not necessarily going to perhaps stop using that supplier. You need to start thinking about your liability from that perspective, going back to the mental and physical health of the workforce. And then thinking about community, whether that's direct effect on neighbours to a construction site relating to noise, dust, etc., or actually the positive benefits that you can be having on local employment, apprenticeships, encouraging local school children to perhaps come and visit or understand what is going on sites and understand the process that's going on. I think the industry in general, construction, property, has a huge amount that we need to do in terms of engaging people that aren't white, middle class, who look like me, doing that locally and encouraging people from different cultural and economic backgrounds to join the industry is really, really important. And then back to governance, which I think Sophie's covered pretty well already, that sort of business level certification and training, showing that you are doing the right thing. This idea of being a net positive business, I think, is really important. The risk management comes back to the health and safety piece, but I think also going forward from an insurance perspective, looking at insurance premiums around how our businesses operate, where they're operating, how they might be affected by weather related or other climate related events will become really important, if not already. Diverse leadership, again, whether that's encouraging a more diverse workforce or just a different way of thinking. Companies that have a more diverse board tend to perform better than those without such a diverse board or leadership group. And looking to really improve business culture. I think that the world has really, really moved on in the last, even 5 years, and certainly since I started work 18, 19 years ago, in terms of how much more supportive we are of workforce and how they're performing. Policy documents, I think, will become very important in terms of supply chain charters. I've just recently signed terms with a company who I'm helping on a couple of things where they're communicating their values and their culture and their expectations of how they behave in the workforce and how they want me to behave when I'm doing work for them. And it's a really nice document to read through, and it helps me understand their expectations and really sort of help to raise the bar in terms of people's behavior doing business with them. Again, data strategy is key. How much data are you collecting? You'll be amazed how much data you have within your company and how you can use that to become more efficient, whether that's through your supply chain, through your energy and waste costs, or through how you're managing your staff. And verification and validation, I think this will be a big bit going forwards, not just for things like your carbon emissions, but verifying the data that you're using perhaps to report on elements of, or KPIs, what key performance indicators to me are key to measuring across all of this, all of these buckets, to understand, well, from this year to next year, how are we going to improve on what we're doing already, and demonstrating some of the really good work that businesses are often already doing. Thanks, Sophie. Brilliant.
Thank you. So what now? I mean, many of you will be at quite different stages of this journey. Some of you may already have embedded sort of ESG strategies, be doing reporting, all of these sorts of things. Others will be, this will be sort of the first time you've had the opportunity to really sit down and think about what ESG might mean for you. So I think in terms of getting started, there's something useful about understanding what questions to ask. So that's really about understanding what ESG is, what's at the heart of it, what's its purpose, and then what questions you need to be asking yourself. So a lot of the initial work for clients is really understanding that, as well as considering the why. Why is this important? Is actually the priority is it about getting sustainability linked loans? Is it about staff engagement and retention? Is it just about, wanting to improve credentials around things like social value? It can be a real mix of those things. It's then also thinking about what are those material considerations. So what are those things that both have having an impact on your company externally, and also then what is the impact you're having. The thing I say and really stress with all my clients is, given this is such a fast moving landscape, what is considered really, really significant now may actually get overtaken by something else in a couple of years' time. So even 2 years ago, so it was an article in The Guardian 2 years ago where embodied carbon was first mentioned, really, that I saw in the popular press. Before then, it was sort of the realm of specialists. And now it's almost like everyday language. So it's fascinating to see how quickly some of the issues and topics being stressed, how quickly they move. And then it's really about start collecting data, establish those key performance indicators and establish those baselines. Please, please, please do not make commitments to anything. So I've had conversations where there have been commitments made, for instance, to net zero, where there has been no baseline established, there has been no kind of effectively any roadmap developed. I like to think of it as, it's a bit like saying I'm going to lose 10 kilos, only I have no idea what I'm going to weigh, what I weigh now, and I have no plan. It's not going to work. And it's really kind of irritating and pretty meaningless. And then there's that sort of final point. So once you've got the data and your approach has been developed and all those sorts of things, it's about how does this get embedded across the organization? So it's not just a kind of top down, or it's not just a subcommittee that reports to a sub-board and whatever over here. It's not just the job of one person. So it's really about how does ESG really get embedded in the overarching kind of business strategy. And Hannah, over to you.
This is just a really simple table showing, and I'm seeing some questions in the Q&A around verification, validation, etc. But some of the key actions here in terms of where to start. I'm sure some of you are on your journey to sustainability and may well have already been doing some of this work that I'm suggesting here. The first main bit is the engagement piece, and that's engaging across all of your business stakeholders, whether that's suppliers, whether it's consultants. The key one is normally your staff and or your clients, depending on your business. But also looking to your suppliers and customers or end user. That might be a one-off event, it might be questionnaires, it might be constant feedback loops. It depends, as I said, on the nature of your business. And then really looking to how you might measure some of the key factors that come up as a result of that engagement process. We do what we call a materiality assessment or gap analysis, which you may have heard of, and we'll use the UN Sustainable Development Goals, so 17 goals, and we'll look at what businesses are doing well, what they're doing not so well, or could do better, and what they're not doing at all. And then we try and look at these key performance indicators relating to which of those goals and also KPIs are most relevant to the business and their most important stakeholders. And that then gives you a measurement or understanding of what you're doing, and you can then use that to set targets and move forwards. And just to be clear, it's not all about carbon emissions. Carbon and global warming is really important, but to me, if you're looking at an ESG strategy, it's probably 15 to 20% of that strategy. The people piece and the governance piece are also really important. So please don't think it's all just about measuring your baseline carbon emissions. The whole engagement piece with your staff and behavior and culture will ultimately affect emissions, but it will also affect your waste and staff happiness levels and how your clients perceive the advice that they're getting. The reporting, certification, collaboration is a really important stage. That is then reporting on the stuff that you're measuring, certifying what you're doing. Validation is a really key point, and I think one of the questions around greenwashing in the Q&A is really, really valid. When I read a 2-page Word document with no figures in it, I know that it's been cobbled together by somebody on the board or in the leadership team, and they're not really doing much more than that. E.ON is a great example. Okay, yes, a listed company, but they've got a really clear process for measuring. They've measured their baseline, they've got their clear targets, and then they've got pages of all the KPIs that they are measuring year on year to show progress across whether that's their energy use in their offices, how much renewable energy they're supplying, the number of customers buying renewable energy, or their gender pay gap stats. And it's really clear that the work that they're doing, and that they have external auditors that come in and verify that the information that they are then reporting on. This will also allow you to improve efficiency, reduce your energy costs, waste costs, and start to really drive profitability. And all of this ultimately is driving liquidity and value. The big debate I used to have with my developer employer was that there was this sort of race to the bottom, and that by doing as little as possible on the sustainability front, they were ultimately impacting their liquidity. Their rents weren't high enough, their yield was affected, and their marketing voids were that much longer as a result. So yeah, that's that one.
Brilliant, thank you. So just to round it off, and I'm sure, so if there was a question around greenwashing, this is how not to do it. So it's basically about having a clear strategy with a clear set of measurable deliverables. It's about accountability and transparency. So if someone were to go away and try and replicate your outputs, your outcomes in terms of how you're measuring things, could they do it? Is there the opportunity to have things externally verified? What would be really interesting in terms of the CSRD rules, which will impact a number of UK companies operating in the UK, is the metrics there have to be independently, externally audited, and it's about having robust data and evidence. So the big message really is to get somewhere, and it's worth just rounding off. So business impacts and serves more than just shareholders. It has an equal responsibility to the community and the planet. And just if you'd like to get in touch, do feel free, if you haven't joined already, the ESG and real estate group, and do obviously feel free to connect with us both on LinkedIn and get in touch if you'd like to talk further. And now over to Emma and Simon.
Super. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Hannah. I think you have been keeping track of the Q&A and the questions, but first of all, before we go into that, yeah, a fascinating arena here of discussions going on, and one that I think all of us, perhaps the first question will be linked to how many of us as smaller businesses sort of tackle this ESG thing, this thing coming over the hill. I think much of us looking at this probably initially have related to what you've been talking to or about to much larger businesses, national, international corporates. But the feeling I get is, as a business owner, this is now drilling down in and affecting smaller businesses as well. So I think the first question is in construction. Construction has a vast array of size of businesses. How is this going to affect all of us in terms of not just the large corporates, but also the smaller ones? And I guess what should we be starting to do now? I mean, you've said a lot already. It's about planning, but how do we engage in this process? Are there any particular certifications we should be aiming for? What's the general view about how this affects smaller companies?
Hannah, do you want to have a first stab and I'll jump in?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I was touching, Simon, on the EPC legislation and the regulations that have just sort of tightened and will tighten again. I think at a very, very basic level, I'm seeing a lot of smaller companies that perhaps didn't even have that on their radar. So I think number one is do your horizon scanning, do read the press and Property Week and the papers, and don't bury your head in the sand. The legislation isn't necessary. The MEIS legislation is covering you at the moment, and I've had clients come to me even in the last month where they've got an EPCF on an older building. They need to do works, they're worried about getting a fine. So I think MEIS is quite a critical one that people still need to make sure that they're complying with, because it could cost a small business a lot of money. Business certifications, there are a lot out there, increasingly so over the last sort of year or two. There are some good options like Planet Mark. I think I've seen a question on B Corporation too. I think it depends a bit on A, your level of understanding, and B, the amount of resource and time you've got. B Corp, I think, is a great certification. It's very all-encompassing. It covers a lot of ground, but it takes a lot of time to gather all that data together. And I think don't underestimate the amount of time that it will take to perhaps do these baseline measurements and pull this initial data together, and then going forwards looking at how perhaps your technology platform on a very simple basis using Power BI with your Microsoft system, for example, to start recording this information going forwards, I think will be really important. So yeah, business certifications, I've mentioned a couple, there are plenty more, and those to me depend a bit on what you're trying to do as a business. For example, a free one that you can all tap into is the Supply Chain Sustainability School, based here in London, which was set up about, I think, 10-15 years ago. It's a really great free resource. They do some superb talks. They start to look at the data piece. They're doing a lot on carbon emissions and some really good stuff on the well-being and people piece, whether that's modern slavery or sort of staff well-being. So I think that's probably where I'd start, and then I'd be thinking about your data and tech. What are you recording? What information do you collect? And lastly, don't overcomplicate it. You'll have 6 to 10 KPIs, which they may be as simple as what's your profit this year. And I always say to people, don't shy away from the fact that you make money, because if you make money, you can reinvest it into good stuff. And then I had another client, he's like, oh, I'm getting really long in the tooth, I've been in business for 30 years. I said, no, Greg, I said, that is the definition of sustainables. I said, not only have you been in business for 30 years, but you've got a load of young partners and you're thinking about succession and you're thinking about that business working for the next generation. And that is the definition of sustainability.
And just the 2 quick points I'd like to add. So there's something really important about engaging with supply chains early on. And the second point, lots, as Hannah said, lots and lots of free sort of tools and resources out there. So, there are various sort of SME carbon calculators, all of these sorts of things. It really is a matter of starting somewhere and keeping it simple.
Super, some very sound advice there. Thank you, Hannah and Sophie. Someone I think mentioned earlier on sort of climate emergency and CDM and how CDM has taken on in our industry. We talked about the pandemic, which really was dealt with as an emergency. Yeah. I think there's a lot of still hesitancy in the industry about it's not yet an emergency. I use those words very cautiously, but I must admit sometimes looking at what we're doing, it doesn't yet feel like an emergency. I guess the question is here, is it linked to some of the chat that's come up about sort of greenwashing and what to back, which certification to back. What's the feeling, Hannah and Sophie, from your clients and looking at the industry? What's the helicopter view of when it will become an emergency? I say that in terms of when are we going to start seeing proper implementation of things like an ISO 9001 and 14001. When will that ramp up and it become a sort of a CDM health and safety issue? Is there any thought? Is it 5 years, 10 years, or can I think
there are a couple of questions there, and Hannah, if you could touch on the CDM point. So something really interesting about that helicopter view, if you look at the sets of issues globally. So for instance, my hometown Brisbane, because of the crazy weather that has suddenly started happening over the last 5-10 years, there are areas in which household insurance has gone up by 6 times. So it's basically someone's full-time income. You have an increasing number of areas in Australia, and I'm sure we're seeing the same in the US and Canada, that are now pretty much uninsurable, or it's so expensive to insure that actually, you've got whole communities where they can't get insurance, no one's going to buy because you can't get a mortgage anywhere. We're already there. I think we haven't quite been confronted as harshly in the UK as yet. Hannah, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I was listening to a podcast yesterday saying it's a sort of north and south hemisphere equality issue. Yeah. We live in more moderate climates. I mean, I went to MIPIM in March, and I was a Tunisian guy was driving me to my apartment, which I'd rented miles out of town because I didn't want to pay stupid amounts in town. And we were talking about people migrating from sub-Saharan Africa, and it's really, really real in Tunisia. And I think just at the moment we're slightly sitting on our little island, complaining about people coming across the channel. But mass migration events, which will happen, we're seeing it in Sudan at the moment. We've seen it in Ukraine. It will start to put some huge pressure, social pressure on European cities and countries, and will affect the relationship with the UK and France, for example, when they're all gathering in Calais and trying to get across to the UK. I think, we're sitting quite pretty just because of geographical location at the moment, and the fact that we perhaps aren't having such extreme weather events. But unfortunately, I'm trying not to get too sort of down in the dumps, but working in this industry, you do read some quite serious stuff about, do we end up with another event like COVID when people's lives are at risk? And we could well come to that point. I mean, bringing it back down to the CDM piece, let's go back to health and safety and get really, really real again. I really think that a lot of this work across ES and G will become like health and safety was, in the sort of 70s and 80s. In the same way that I feel if you'd said 20 years ago that a SEGRO warehouse with solar panels on the roof would be producing so much more energy than even the warehouse needs, that they're now plugging that energy into local community buildings within the vicinity of their warehouse. And I do think in 20 years' time, alongside ESG being integral into everything we do, like the health and safety piece, we'll see buildings that sequester more carbon than they deliver. But we've got to see some quite big structural change to get to that point. Have I answered your piece on the CDM? How quickly do I think it's going to happen? There's huge frustration from my perspective that we are operating in a real legislative void at the moment. The ones on the horizon, I mean, we've already touched on Part L, Part F, Part Z, someone's put in Part O. Thank you for dropping that in as well, this overheating piece. As you'll see behind me, I've got some huge windows. I'm looking at fitting thermal blinds because this room gets unbearably hot in the summer. We've then got the future home standard, and just, as I said, horizon scanning to see where that legislation is going to come in, whether we are going to get this EER alongside the EPC, so looking at your energy efficiency rating, so that's your operational rate energy use at any point in time. The EPC is slightly more theoretical, it can last for 10 years, what have you. So making sure really simply that you've got sub-meters on different floors, or you definitely have a sub-meter for your floor of whatever building you occupy if you lease a building. Things like that are really important to start looking at, so that you can accurately measure what your energy usage is on a single floor or for your office, for example.
Super, thank you both. So we talked a lot about the carbon bit. The people and the governance is something that I guess we could spend a lot more time on, and actually we are running out of time. But in terms of the people, I imagine they are linked to the carbon bit. I mean, in Cambridge, I think many of our members will tell you one of the biggest risks and threats they have to their business at the moment is employing people and retaining people. I do imagine in my head there's a link between the people and the carbon and the governance in terms of your staff seeing what your roadmap is, what your governance is, and
Absolutely.
is there any data out there that can convince some of the boards that run our businesses in Cambridge that you really do need to think about this? It will help your bottom line and also your recruitment strategies. I mean, are there any studies that show the link between a well-managed ESG business and their ability to recruit and retain the best staff?
I haven't seen anything specific, Hannah. You might know differently, but I do know I did read something at the beginning of last year, particularly focusing on oil and gas and the fundamental issues that they're having with recruitment. Because they're used to these massive kind of graduate cohorts coming in, graduates just no longer want to work with them. And it's a real issue across that industry. I think even potentially for those where they're looking to decarbonize.
And KPMG did a study, I think, in 2021, and they said, or they found, of the 2,500 grads that they'd surveyed, saying that 1 in 4 grads had turned down a job off the back of a company's ESG strategy. So I do think it's becoming increasingly important.
Absolutely, sounds very compelling. Well, look, Sophie and Hannah, I think yes, this conversation could go on, and there's some questions I'm afraid I haven't been able to pose to you today, but we are running out of time. But just on behalf of the CFCI trustees and our members, thank you very much for devoting the time today to come and speak to us. We are recording this and we'll upload it to our website, and make sure everybody's aware of who you are and how you can help our businesses here in the construction industry in Cambridge. Just to finish on a couple of points, parish notices. Tomorrow we have our walking tour. Unfortunately, it's sold out, but just to remind everybody that who has signed up to the walking tour, Innovation Beyond the Backs does turn up tomorrow. And then next week on the 15th of May, we have our annual debate, which is linked to what we've been hearing about today. Debate is, this House believes that Cambridge's zero carbon targets are unachievable. Blimey, that's a pretty negative title, but actually it should spark quite a lot of debate, and we've got some great speakers, so please do sign up to that. I think tickets are still available. So with 1 minute to go, once again, Sophie and Hannah, huge thanks. Thank you very much for talking to us today on a fascinating topic, and I'm now going to be very rude and say goodbye to everybody. That's it, end over. Thank you again to listening to us all, and see you all soon. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks all.